Hello everyone, my name is Agata Evans and I am a Senior Procurement Manager for Aston Martin, a former employee of RS Group. Today we are going to be looking at the future of indirect procurement and discussing the key takeaways from the 2025 procurement report created by RS Group and Ireland in association with Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. You can download the report from the link in the comments. We will be speaking to David. David, could you please introduce yourself?
Certainly. My name is David Loseby. I'm a Professor of Research Impact in Supply Chain Management at Leeds University Business School. And I'm also Editor-in-Chief of some academic journals, in particular the Journal of Public Procurement, which is very relevant to the topic today.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll be talking about quite a lot of interesting themes. We'll be looking at the evolving challenges, the supply-based paradox, the cost versus quality dilemma, and ESG. So moving to a first question. The latest report highlights that the growing concern in procurement are 62% of professionals are worried about the inflation and the rising costs. 47% are focused on managing supply chain risks, and 37% are concerned about global political uncertainty. We all can agree that those challenges are not new, but they're getting tougher and tougher every year. So looking ahead, how do you see those challenges progressing? And could you give any practical advice to procurement professionals to let them stay ahead of the curve?
Well, I think what we do recognise is that there will be certainly a continuum. I mean, it's in essence the sort of the recognition of the polycrisis that we're actually in. I think the reality is that there will continue to be more disruption, more issues, if you like, across the supply chains. I think the reality is that because, by the very definition of a polycrisis, there will be activities and instances where there will be disruption, there will be issues in terms of costs and geopolitical events, etc., that will continue to stress supply chains. I think the reality is because there's no blueprint, and the reality is that also different events, albeit that they may be similar to what we've witnessed in the past, the different sort of, I'll call it dynamics and aspects will not be exactly the same. So as I said, there's no blueprint really. And I think this then points to sort of the whole essence of having to be more agile, more adaptable, more flexible as we go forward. And I think that brings into play different skill sets for us in the procurement and supply chain professions. I think what we're witnessing is the need for greater levels of collaboration. I think the recognition that, we will get hit with disruptions in our supply chains. I think it's not a question of if, I think it's a question of when and how. And so I think having that preparedness, I think, is so important. And that's why I think having more agile supply chains is probably going to be more important to us. And what that might mean is that actually, rather than having single source type arrangements, we may have to have multiple source arrangements. We may have to have staging arrangements. People have talked a lot more about insourcing as opposed to outsourcing, about shifting where we draw supply from, but also I think looking at the opportunities that sustainability and environmental and other considerations and an approach to more circular supply chains gives us in terms of the resiliency that is necessary in the world that we're actually facing into. So I do think it means that we're going to have to take different lenses to what we do. But of course, the recognition is that legislation is increasing significantly. I think I counted this morning, funny enough, because I had to check my facts. I think there's 37 new pieces of legislation kind of come into vogue in the ESG and sustainability space in 2025. So the reality is that we have a very complex environment that we're going into, and the chances are that there will certainly be more. So I think the whole agility and flexibility piece is so important. And I think what this says to us is that, taking the sort of what I call the traditional category management approach, almost in a sense has to be reinvented and redefined in terms of what we do. And what we're seeing as well is that the classical skills that we had in procurement profession are almost now, yes, you can have the classical skills, but actually we're now looking for people with specialist skills in digital, in ESG, in soft skills, etc. So the mix of what we've got and the cognitive diversity that we need within our teams is increasing significantly. And I think, as I said, I don't think there is a blueprint that says if we just simply do it this way, it will all be fine. It won't. I think we have to be a lot more adaptable.
So if you were just to give one thing that people could do it today, what would be the first thing they should?
I think for me, the one thing that I would do, and many people have talked about sort of, consolidating their supply base and things like that. I would actually take a contrarian strategy and say, don't move towards simply because you can leverage the cost and go to a lowest cost denominator. I would make sure that you've got sufficient resiliency in your supply chain and the selection of the suppliers and service providers that you use, such that way then you can draw from different sources and different ways of satisfying your demand through that more diverse supply chain.
And that takes us nicely to the next question, because there's an interesting contradiction in this report. So 50% of professionals say they want to consolidate their suppliers. 46% are looking to get more value from their supply chain. However, despite this intention, the number of suppliers in most of organizations has increased by 18%. Why do you think we see this shift? And would you say that the businesses are struggling to balance consolidation with risk mitigation?
I think, as I said before, I think one of the things that we're witnessing is that the reality that actually, and in some ways, you could say the lessons that we learned out of the COVID-19 period. One of the things that we recognized was that actually, it doesn't matter how sort of watertight you think you've got a contract for, the harsh reality is if a supplier says to you, look, I'm shipping through the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, or actually I can't get the raw materials, then back to the point you've made, which is an increase of 18-20% in the supply base, doesn't surprise me, because I think the reality is that it's not just that. There are other factors in terms of, certainly during the COVID period, many organizations had to reconfigure their supply chains. They also had to, how can I put it, mothball certain production lines. We also saw what was termed as being the grey exit, which is lots and lots of experienced technical and other staff, professional staff, actually left lots and lots of industries and sectors. And so that diversity of the workforce is no longer really there. And so what we're having to do is to adapt to that reality. And the things that were predicted at the time of COVID-19 was that we're going to see the bullwhip effect. And I think this is exactly what is playing out at the moment. Hence the reason why, when we look at sort of the way in which organizations built huge stocks, so lots of people did that in lots of different sectors. The reality was that obviously that then put lots of cost and strain in terms of working capital, cash flow, all of those kind of things. So as we came out of the COVID-19 period, lots of people said, oh, wait a minute, we're going to have to burn down all of that stock. So they burnt it down, and now you had quite a frugal stock level. And of course, as then we get this geopolitical disruption and other disruptions in the supply chain, the reality is that you then don't have a big inventory that you're sitting on that can then absorb that sort of those shocks, if you like, that you're getting within the supply chain. So I think what we've got is almost that sort of ripple effect going through the supply chain. But I think also what you're then getting is that people are very cautious and nervous to invest. The cost of borrowing has gone up considerably. So therefore, putting in investment into new machinery, new equipment, new facilities, people are very nervous about doing something like that. So I think we've got a number of quite fragile factors. I mean, it's interesting. We've had the terminology VUCA and BANI sort of introduced, if you like, into the lexicon for procurement and supply chain people. But I think we're almost at BANI 2.0. In other words, I think we've moved on to the next generation of BANI because this brittleness, this ambiguity and uncertainty that we've got is magnified, and actually we've got different variants of it happening at different times, but not the same combinations that we've seen in the past. So what we've got is quite an unstable, if you like, in a sense, environment in terms of supply and provision. And I think that complexity will continue. And I think that's why many organizations are facing into the reality that simply relying upon a very tight supply base is actually not serving them well in terms of then delivering the resiliency that they need in order to service their customer base. So I think this is quite a natural reaction. I don't think it's anything that we should be too surprised about. In fact, in some ways, you would argue that actually, as I said earlier, having a more diverse and almost, I'll argue, a slightly more extensive supply base than perhaps we've been used to shouldn't be a surprise to us, because we've had quite a relatively stable period of several decades prior to COVID. We're now in a very different environment. So servicing it with exactly the supply chain that was good for the previous 2 or 3 decades is not going to work. So we have to recognize that we've got a different set of dynamics that we are trying to accommodate, and that requires a different supply chain to address it. I don't think it's particularly complicated when we step back and look at it in that sort of light, really. I think the dynamics of, to your earlier statistics in terms of people want to consolidate the supply base, I'd actually challenge that and say, I understand why you might want to do that, because there are constraints upon resources and things like that. But I think the harsh reality is that I think sometimes, I've seen this in my own, how can I put it, areas where I've worked in other sectors in terms of manufacturing or retail or whatever it happens to be. But actually that consolidation, and particularly moving to single supply, is hugely dangerous, and I would guard against it.
So how do we strike this perfect balance? I
think the perfect balance in some ways actually is almost a uniqueness that is relevant to each and every individual organisation and sector, and so therefore back to the sort of I don't think there is a blueprint. I really don't think there is. There's some principles, and I think the principles are that we have to have agility, adaptability and flexibility, but also we have to have resiliency. And I think that resiliency comes through the right balance of supply chain to service our customer base.
Thank you. So moving to the next question. The report shows that 60% of procurement teams are facing budget cuts for 2025, and 40% of professionals are asking to lower their inventory cost. Jane Lynch from Cardiff Business School warns that there is only so much that you can cut before you actually impact the quality. Do you think that we have reached a tipping point, that we are taking too much in terms of the cost and we're impacting the quality? And what advice would you give it to procurement professionals to make sure that that doesn't happen?
Oddly enough, I know Jane very well, actually, and understand the sentiments behind that. I think the reality is that this is probably nothing particularly new in terms of budget pressures, managing sort of cost, time, quality, the classic sort of triangle, if you like. But I think what that should say to us is that that's a classic opportunity. That is an opportunity to think about things in a very different way, which is, if we've got those pressures, then we should see that as an opportunity to say, how can we do this differently? How can we look at this, excuse me, in a different lens? So I think taking that fresh look at things and applying some critical thinking to this, I think is hugely important. And I think that that sort of reset is where really procurement people should step in and say, let's think about this differently. Excuse me. So I think that sort of opportunity to refresh and relook at things. I mean, I've talked to people about sort of, for instance, if we manufacture something in a particular way, let's say it's deductive manufacturing as opposed to additive manufacturing. In other words, taking material away as opposed to adding bits together to make the product or the whatever it is. Yes, that might be an investment and a change to the way in which we produce something. But if we can do that in a way that then becomes more sustainable in the future, excuse me, and means that we can ensure that we can do this in a sustainable way and reduce waste. We can reduce the amount and quantity of materials that we actually need. There are ways then that then starts to address a number of things which are interconnected in terms of making what we do more sustainable, taking out cost, thinking about different ways in which we can produce things, thinking about different materials that we can use. So I think this is the perfect opportunity to say, for instance, as we had to do within the COVID period, and many of us lived through that, the 7 days a week, almost 24/7 is what it felt like. But the reality is that when somebody says, actually, we can't get that material or we can't get it in that sort of quantity, you then have to say, right, there are no options. This is the harsh reality we're facing. And therefore, the lessons learned out of COVID, which was we've got to do things differently, has to be part and parcel of where we go, right, let's draw on those experiences. What do we do differently? How do we find ways around that? And I think, as I was saying to, the guys earlier, you think about sort of, as container costs went up exponentially, I think they went up by a factor of 10 or whatever it was in a very, very short period of time. People then suddenly said, "Oh, wait a minute, hang on a minute. We're shipping fresh air. Let's look at the packaging. Let's think about how we can do this differently." So if we can ship 5 containers rather than 10 containers, fantastic. Because the other issue was not just the cost, but actually we couldn't secure containers on a ship, as in there wasn't the volume available. So that. If that then forces us to think and do things differently, we should apply those lessons just the same today, because they're the same dynamics, if you like, in a sense, apply to what we're trying to do now, which is lower budgets, difficulties in terms of sourcing, disruptions in the supply chain. I think it's all exactly the same, to be honest with you.
So I 100% agree. What you said before, that I agree, a crisis kind of brings people together,
Yeah.
but then you also mentioned that in today's world we have to be more collaborative. I agree.
Yes.
If procurement is part of a solution, I think we genuinely can add more value, but it is easier said than done. So what kind of practical advice would you give it to people? Because it's not just us looking, procurement people, how to do things differently. If you want to do things differently, you really have to bring everybody on board.
Yeah.
So any practical advice, how you go about it?
Well, I think the one thing that I would always recognise, and collaboration is quite an interesting thing, because this often goes right the way back to how you set a contract up. And for instance, many organisations have had contracts where, going into COVID, they had contracts that said, we will guarantee you X amount of volume for the next 3 years, and we'll have a third sort of thing. So very, very fixed and defined quantities. COVID hit, Rolls-Royce Aerospace and Defence, good example. Effective flying hours dropped by 80% in the first quarter of COVID. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out that that's going to do something quite significant to your production line. So going in and speaking to suppliers, and very simplistically, having the conversation that says, look, you can force us to sort of take the 12 months worth of quantity because the break doesn't come until month 12 sort of thing. But you do realise then that we won't order anything then for the next 2 years. Is that really what you want? And of course the sensible collaboration then is to say, right, let's work out what's the new glide path that takes us away out of that and takes us into something that is manageable on both sides of the equation. And I think that's where that sort of collaboration takes place, because you have to find that commonality, despite the fact that there will be pain to be shared by all parties. I think that's the harsh reality. But you have to face into that. You can't have a winner-takes-all approach to this.
No, thank you. So moving on to the next question, sustainability. And sustainability has really moved up the agenda in the procurement. According to our report, 53% of companies now have sustainable and ethical procurement policy, and that is up from 26% in 2023. 48% have a plan to reduce their carbon footprint. But with going back to the point with raising cost, do you think that sustainability efforts will take a backseat?
I think if you look at it from the point of view, and again, I've discussed this on many occasions. I think the erroneous assumption is that sustainability costs money, it adds costs. The time and time again, we've proven that actually doing something that is sustainable, repeatable, and if you think about SDG 12, which is all about responsible production and consumption, this is a shift to a different way of thinking, and even in a recent sort of organisation that I work with, thinking about looking at areas, if you like, in a context that's more holistic. And an example that I would give is that you take a retail organisation that requires air conditioning units to be within the retail context. If you've got air conditioning units that are old and they break down frequently, so therefore the customer experience is not good. Also, they don't have, and I'm going to use a couple of technical terms here, so apologies. If those old air conditioning units don't have what's called frequency inverters, then they consume 40% more energy as a consequence of not having a more, I'll call it, advanced type of technology used within that air conditioning unit. Now, whilst the initial cost might be slightly more, we all know in procurement and supply chain terms that we've got to look at whole life cost. Now, if that saves you 40% energy consumption and energy costs are going up and up and up as we speak, and then you start to look at, okay, then so we've got the other factor, which is that's a carbon reduction because we're using 40% less energy. If you put all those metrics together and you put them all on one dashboard, suddenly lots and lots of different departments across the organisation become interested because the customer relationship guys go, fantastic, got no more complaints in the retail outlet. Sustainability director, he's very happy because we've reduced 40% of the carbon emissions. Finance and procurement are very happy because we've actually taken cost out. So I think it's a more holistic approach that is necessary. But also I think the whole sort of, invoking the critical thinking around saying that we've got to think about this differently. We can't go sustainability equals cost, because it doesn't. And I think this is where we've got to sort of get past that sort of, almost it's a mindset block, I think, where people go, sustainability, okay, that means we've got to do green and environmental and that it's always more expensive. No, I think it's about saying we've got to do things differently. And if you think about the whole dynamics around sort of rare earth elements that we know are integral to the production of EV batteries, solar power, wind turbines. The harsh reality is that we're only recovering about 3, 4, maybe 5%, if we're lucky, of those rare earth elements in what we're doing currently, as opposed to gold, which is, I think, at something like 87%, I think it is. So that's much more advanced. But the reality then means that we've now got to create 293 mega global mines to produce sufficient rare earth elements over the next 5 years to 2030. So the reality is that not having that sort of sustainable approach to what we're doing, we simply can't satisfy what we believe to be, I think it's a bit of a false solution towards environmental sustainability. So I think that means that we've got to think about this in a more circular term, which is if we put some materials in, we've got to be able to be sure that we can recover them out the other side. And that's just taking a more ethical approach to what we do. If, as we've recognised, legislation then has to be invoked to sort of say to people, no, we're going to level the playing field and we're going to make everybody be more sustainable in what they do, then I think that's probably the way in which the legislation is going. But I think, as I said earlier, that whole new landscape of additional sort of legislation shouldn't surprise us in a way, because we've been given the chance as, I'll call it, private enterprise to shift the dial. And of course, the first movers do it and then realise, hang on a minute, not all the competition are doing it. So should we do it or shouldn't we? You know, and I think that sort of that creates its own sort of turbulence, if you like, within the marketplace. But I think by levelling it out and saying that everybody has to follow the same set of rules, I think is an equitable way of moving that forward.
I do kind of agree that probably a lot of organization needs the push towards sustainability.
Yes.
But then I kind of agree with you that at the moment sustainability is treated like as a separate topic, a separate function, and quite often somebody else's problem in the organization.
Yes.
So what is a procurement role to kind of drive the sustainability agenda
I think,
across the businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my sense of that is that I think procurement's role can almost be a bit chameleon-like in a way, which is, in certain cases, I think we should be leading certain things. In other cases, we should be facilitating certain things. In other cases, we should be supporting things. But I think the reality is that again, it comes back to the essential skill of collaboration, which is this is a collective effort. This is not one individual department. And I think that's why taking the approach that says, like I gave the example of the air conditioning, it's interesting because the organisation, as I waved them goodbye sort of thing and said, the MD of the business said, you've actually made us think differently about this, and actually you've brought many disparate functions together because we've now got a collective dashboard that we all input and benefit from. So I think changing that dynamic is really, really important. And I think this is a shift in the way in which organisations operate. So it's back to sort of almost the organisational culture, but also the mindset and approach of the organisation. So it has to be done at an organisational level. It can't be done at a functional level. So I think this is the difference. This is the shift. And traditionally, if you like, marketing went off and did marketing, and everybody said that was all very creative and very nice sort of thing. Finance was just concentrated on the numbers, etc. But I think those stereotypes are no longer fit for purpose. And I think this is where the additive skills and the diversity of skills and the cognitive diversity that goes with that is hugely important for organisations to become competitive and seek to sort of derive effectively advantage over other organisations by doing that.
So I kind of agree. Then I like the way how you said that we have to be chameleons, and I think in that we procurement people sometimes talk our procurement language. We're probably good with bringing people to a table. I think we quite often don't talk as stakeholders language. And I think in here to a success will be what you mentioned. People will have different agendas. We won't want all the same thing. And kind of, I think, creating this one joint dashboard in everybody's common language probably might be this key to a success.
I think it is important. I mean, it's. I think the one thing that one of the terms that I've used in many businesses is to say our job should be to make sense and translate. And what I mean by that is understand what the issue is, but then translate it in a way that somebody else will understand it in their language or in their, how can I put it, their set of indicators, their set of objectives, whatever it happens to be. Our job should be able to connect those things. And again, it's sort of the classic, which is, if you speak different languages, as I know you do, and I do, the ability to be able to communicate with a different community in a different language is hugely powerful. And so therefore, I think we should see that as one of our USPs, one of our skills in a sense, to reframe communication that we might be utilizing within the business. So the classic that I learned many years ago, much to my embarrassment, was that using the same presentation deck with every single function in the business is not good enough. You've got to tailor it to the audience in a sense that is then listening to that and responding to it and engaging with it. And so I think that customization, albeit it's the same facts, it's the same information, but it's presented differently, is so important. And I think the mistake that I've made it, so hands up as they say, but the recognition that simply playing the same thing to everybody is not good enough. And our job should be to say, what language is this community speaking? How do I need to connect with them much better? And that should be part of the job.
So what was your saying with the translation? I'll mark it for myself. Did you say that our job is to
make sense and translate? Yeah. So our job should be to make sense and translate it for other people in their language, if you like, or in their way of understanding it.
I'm gonna steal that. But moving on to the next question, ESG. So 4 out of 5 professionals can answer a question on how they assess the ESG maturity of their suppliers. But majority of carbon coming from company supply chain. So what more can procurement people do to track and reduce Scope 3 emissions down the supply chain?
Well, I think one of the things that I've always recognized is, and there's various ways of looking at this, obviously you have to make sure that you've got what I call the governance and sponsorship piece in place, which is to say, you can't have what I call passive governance and sponsorship. It's got to be active. It's got to be proactive. And you've got to be able to say, right, I need to be able to baseline exactly where I am. So it's the classic, if I don't know where what my start point is, I've got no chance of working out where I need to go to. So I think developing those things is quite important. The greenhouse gas protocol set out 15, if you like, classifications of Scope 3 emissions. We all know that Scope 3 emissions accounts for 80% plus for most supply chains and most organisations. So you've got 8 upstream, 7 downstream. Now recognising those, understanding them, and then being able to start to sort of then say, right, what methodology and what quantification rules are we going to apply to our supply chains, recognising there are different standards, different reporting tools, different approaches. So you have to sort of say, which one am I going to choose? Which one am I going to adopt and why? And you'll also recognise that around the world, different sectors and different geographies home in on different reporting standards and different things. It's so important to understand that context, because making sure that you address it in the context that is understood within the geography and the sector, hugely important, because you get a lot more synergy and traction by doing that. So I think by doing those kind of things is so important. But then once you've established that baseline, then work through a realistic plan that says this is how we're going to implement it. I mean, again, another example from personal experience where somebody said, oh, we're going to be net zero by 2030. And I thought, well, that's pretty racy. That sounds fantastic. However, we did a quick analysis on the top 20 suppliers of this organization, which is about 70% of their spend. And the quick analysis said 18 of those 20 suppliers are saying net zero by 2050, and 2 are saying net zero by 2040. And guess what? Some of those suppliers are like sort of Microsoft and Google. I can't imagine that they're suddenly going to go, oh, it's okay, we'll adjust our net zero targets by 20 years. Don't you worry about it. We'll fix that. You've got to face into the reality of the fact that, again, it's that close collaboration and cooperation with your supply chain that's so important, and it's an integral part of what you need to do. But again, collaboration is a fundamental in working with those organizations and the data that goes with it.
But then I kind of find that the big companies, they kind of have to do it. We live in a world that we have very complex supply chains, people coming from different parts of the world,
Yeah.
and not everybody is where we are. So how are we going to do about those more challenging, smaller suppliers? And
I think that's a realistic challenge that we all have to face into. But again, I think this is where, again, coming back to the collaboration piece, which is, it doesn't matter how loudly you shout at somebody, if they don't have the capability to do something, you're far better off going, you know what, let me just figure out how I can best help this organization to do this. And if I need to share some resources with them for a week, 2 weeks, whatever the number happens to be, and help them get that in place, one, you've built a very strong alliance and a very powerful piece of supplier relationship has been developed as a consequence of that. The chances are then they'll reciprocate and say, actually, we've got some new R&D. Would you like to be beneficiary, if you like, a first beneficiary of our R&D activity, as a response to saying we're helping that organisation to help them with the challenges of ESG and sustainability calculations and things like that. So I think it's taken a more holistic approach again to this, rather than saying I can demand this. Yes, you might demand it, but if the capability isn't there then to simply deliver it, it doesn't matter how long you demand it and how hard you bang the table, it's not going to come. So you have to go, what's my alternative? How can I do this differently? And I think it is about working with organizations and people and developing the strength of those relationships to do that sort of thing. The reciprocation will come back in other forms.
I always wonder then, so going back now to those big companies, like when you had those top 20, you kind of think Microsoft, okay. A lot of people would then assume, Microsoft, they have to do it as well.
Yeah.
Do we stop then at Microsoft, or would you then, because you kind of could assume that Microsoft will then go down the supply chain and do their due diligence because they cannot afford not to do that. So is that okay of an approach, or would you suggest, no, you have to go down the supply chain as much as you can yourself?
I think you have to go down the supply chain. I mean, I think the one thing that I've always sort of taken store by is to say assumptions are dangerous things. And I think this is where you have to ask the right open questions in a way that is developing trust and collaboration across the whole entire supply chain. And just going as far as tier one is not good enough, frankly. And the chances are, particularly if you start to say, well, okay, I'll give you an example. Our energy supplier, which didn't feature in that top 20 list that we developed, somewhere down in tier 2, tier 3 or whatever. But actually, we all know that energy, from a scope 3 perspective and CO2 emissions, is one of the top 3 categories in terms of CO2 emissions. So therefore, again, I think it's about taking that more holistic approach and saying, no, we can't just afford to look at tier 1. No, we can't just afford to assume, because they're dangerous things. I think it's about, and again, I recognise other colleagues where they've gone, we've used some norms and we've used some benchmarks and assumptions, but actually it drove a whole series of erroneous decisions that we did. And actually, when we did the correct calculations, we were required to do completely different things. So I think this whole misnomer of just taking a bunch of assumptions and benchmarks is good enough and that will be fine. No, I don't think it is. Yes, it might give you an indicator, but I don't think it's something good enough to rely upon to develop what I would call a robust plan forward.
And in your example that you gave about those top 20 companies, out of interest, after looking at this differently, where did the strategy took you after changing the goal, or?
Yes, it did. It did, very simplistically, because the reality was that everybody said, oh, so-and-so organisation who we see as a peer in our sector have said that they're going to do this, so we felt we had to do the same. And I said, well, yeah, that might be true. I said, but I suspect they've probably not done their homework. And again, that comes back to the assumption, which is, well, if they've said that they're going to go net zero by 2030 or 2035, don't simply assume that they've done their homework and worked out what's the right number.
It's kind of not looking at what everybody else is doing, but kind of making sure what you can do and when can you do it, and then kind of stick to it.
Yeah, it's back to the sort of just making sense of the information you're given, and not sort of simply taking it for granted. And I think, as procurement people, I think we're quite good at sort of going, you've told me, give me this information, but I'm going to triangulate that information through multiple sources.
Yeah, we kind of always listen, but then go double check and, as you said, interpret our own way.
Correct. Absolutely.
No, so moving on to the next question. MRO spend is up 20% year on year, reaching an average of 2 million per organization. But 59% of procurement professionals, they don't know how much actually it costs to process an order. How big of the issue do you think this lack of visibility is?
I think it's a big issue in many organisations. In fact, I remember doing a diagnostic on one organisation probably a couple of years or so back, and they never looked at the number of invoices that were coming in from each supplier. And I just went and sat in the accounts payable department for half a day and said, right, okay then, you tell me how many invoices do we get from each supplier? I also want to know how many queries do we have to deal with, how many order amendments do we have to deal with, how many requisitions, and we'll just build up a profile, just, quick and dirty, nothing too complex. I just need to know just the outline. And I came back then to the executive board and I said, I think there's something you need to sort of get your arms around, because I said, you've got one supplier that's not a top 100 supplier. They send you 2,340 invoices a year. That is value destruction to their business, and it's also value destruction to your business. To have a consolidated invoice per month or something like, or even every 2 weeks, depending on the category it is and the type of activity, is more than sufficient. Looking at the number of invoice queries as it pertains to a supplier, why are they consistently getting it wrong or whatever? Fix the issues at the source. And to the point that I think the question was, I don't know how much it costs to process an order, or an invoice, I think it was. Process an invoice is about £15 to £20. Now you multiply that up by hundreds of thousands, suddenly you go, right, okay then. So we're just being very busy fools then, are we? Because we're processing tens of thousands of invoices. And it's quite common amongst many, many organisations, because it doesn't hit the radar, because it's just another invoice that's just going through, but also down to the number of queries that they're processing. Usually that then invokes a backlog. Suppliers get frustrated because they're not being paid, but nobody's even taking the time or trouble to tell them what's wrong with the invoice and why is it not being processed. So I think there's lots of things to be done in that area, where these sort of, how can I put it? I call it the low-hanging fruit, whereby just going in and fixing the 80-20 of some of those things can make a huge difference. But the other thing then is, by doing that, particularly if you're in procurement, the amount of sort of recognition you get then from accounts payable and the finance function going, you've just taken all that workload off us, they will be very grateful. And then when you want that support, if you like, from that part of the organisation, guess what? They'll be there and they'll be willing to support you, because you've seen the benefit of helping them to reduce their workload. So I think this comes back to the whole sort of doing the right thing, does have its benefits. And I think just, again, looking at it holistically is so important.
I kind of agree, because we procurement people, we ourselves hate purchase orders approvals, invoices, queries, but it seems to be, it causes a lot of noise, isn't it? And a lot of stakeholders then kind of creates a bad name for us very often, isn't it? Because they kind of see us a face of it.
Yes.
So not even from the efficiency perspective, but from kind of, as you're saying, creating this good image, making sure that people are happy on this end, and then we can go and actually concentrate on things that procurement people do like to do.
Yeah.
But then where does the e-procurement solution? So a lot of people always complain that invoicing processing is wrong because lack of systems or a lot of systems not talking to each other. Is e-procurement solutions a solution for it?
I think it can be, but I think also the reality for me then is you need to be prepared to sort of, how can I put it, get into the engine room of the e-procurement and what is happening, and be prepared then to say, that's not working, so we've got to fix it. You've got to sort of recognize that, how can I put it? I'll call it sort of automating something that is broken is not fixing the problem. You're just speeding up the way in which the problem occurs. So I think going in and fixing the problem is so important. And so therefore I think there is a blend of, yes, we've got to automate certain things, and yes, we can use digital systems to do amazing things, but also we've got to recognize that not every single thing will fit within the box. So I think sometimes being able to call out and say, those things don't belong in a digital e-procurement system. A classic one was I got called out by an organisation, again, that shall remain nameless, that said, we work with farming cooperatives in XYZ countries. They don't even have a phone, let alone a computer or a laptop, because these are farming cooperatives in developing nations where we're bringing produce in from. But we're asking these supplier cooperatives to trade through an e-procurement system. And they're going, they don't speak English, they don't have a telephone, they certainly don't have a laptop. So you have to find a different solution. So is that then through an intermediary solution that is the way in which you can fix that? And suddenly the thing all then just sorted itself out. But I think this is about listening and understanding and not going one size fits all, because it doesn't. And I think being prepared to make some of those bold decisions sometimes is really important. And I think changes then the reputation of the procurement departments who go and just simply insist that everybody complies. That's not always the answer. So I think you have to be prepared to listen and adapt, not just simply dictate, because I think that's then we earn the title of procurement police, because we're not super friendly.
I think we're kind of learning that, going back to the point that we have to speak the language of the people.
Yes.
And not just talk. Nobody, but our stakeholders often don't care about procurement policy, and we kind of go and like, oh, you have to do it because the procurement policy says, isn't it? So,
and I think that's, again, that goes back to the sort of the make sense and translate, which is if you make sense of what that part of the business is doing, so that might be engaging with Guatemalan farmers for cocoa beans or whatever it happens to be, actually understanding that and then adapting to make sure that there is a solution that feeds into ultimately a system that you may have set up. I think that's perfectly acceptable. But I think that's not something that we should do lightly, but I think it's something that we have to listen to and adapt and find solutions. And that's what procurement should be there to do.
So as a final remark, if you were to give, because I believe there will be a lot of people who have this problem. So one practical advice for what everybody without any budget can do tomorrow, well, actually Monday, because tomorrow is Saturday, to go and start solving this problem.
I think in terms of digital procurement, and it's something that I've worked in that area for quite a number of years, but I think classically what you have to say is, what is the motivation for an individual, not an organization, not a department, but an individual to want to do something a different way. And if you can figure out that motivation and you can provide that motivation in a way that is ethical and appropriate and actually allows, if you like, in a sense, the organization to operate efficiently and compliant, then that's what you should try and seek to do, and not simply enforce, I'm going to put it, almost a utilitarian sort of way of just saying everybody does it this way. I think that's the adaptability that we've got to start to think about.
Oh, thank you, David. And I think now we'll open the floor to the questions from the audience. So, first question. How should procurement leaders prioritize long-term stability versus short-term cost savings measures?
This will always be a tricky one, because there'll always be budgetary pressures, and I think that's not going to go away. That's part and parcel of the territory. I think what you have to do is to say, what are the things that need to structurally change in the arrangement and how we do something? And I think that this is where then developing that sort of deeper and closer relationships with suppliers, and particularly for critical and essential sort of areas of categories or components or services, whatever it happens to be, you determine what those priorities are. The reality is you won't be able to tackle all of them simultaneously. So you will have to prioritize. I think by prioritizing the right areas, recognizing those that are of higher risk, higher vulnerability, higher levels of disruption, and prioritizing them in that way. But also, I think, being very transparent sometimes and communicating that with the supply base and saying, look, we see you as a supplier that has moderate resiliency issues, moderate disruption issues. Therefore, you're going to be in wave 2 or wave 3. It's quite interesting that by being very open and transparent and saying, we can't tackle this with you guys this year, but you're in the program next year, can be hugely powerful.
People do have sometimes this struggle to what can they share and what they shouldn't be sharing, but I think we do have to learn to have more trust with the people that we have relationships with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the things that we're going to have to get comfortable with, and it's part and parcel of that. I remember very vividly seeing an instruction sheet that was issued by a French supermarket chain to their buyers in terms of how they should treat suppliers. To say it was very hostile would be an understatement, but I think the recognition is that we're now moving into an area where, as I said, we are in a polycrisis. There is so much more instability, disruption, uncertainty, etc. Actually, the only thing that we can realistically do is to be more open, more transparent, more engaging, and develop deeper relationships, because it's a bit like the classic team play. One person isn't a team, and so therefore we're not going to work our way out of this trying to do it on our own. So we have to collaborate.
Yeah, thank you. So next question. How can companies foster innovation through closer collaboration with their suppliers?
Again, I would look at it from the point of view of saying, you can't do it with all your suppliers. It goes back to what I was saying. You can't do it with all your suppliers. You're going to have to prioritize, because you've got a finite amount of resources. But I think also, this isn't a decision that you take independently in procurement. I think this is where you have to absolutely consult with all your internal stakeholders and go, right, these are the options, these are the resources that we've got, these are the risks, dependencies, resiliency issues that we've got. Let's collectively agree what our priorities are going to be and link that to how the organizational strategy, the organizational goals and objectives are aligned. Because I think through that process, whatever you then decide, even if one particular area, department, whatever function, whatever it happens to be, doesn't get their if you like, in a sense, issue prioritized, they will at least recognize it and they will take ownership for the decisions that you then make in the collective. And that is so important, because doing something, how can I put it, you've decided on your own is not the way to go. So you have to, it is very much the instance where you've got to have the collective buy-in to what the direction of travel is that you're going to take, but the recognition, like, I remember very vividly, again, sort of as a CPO, saying, look, we've got a list of 20 things. I can only do 7 of them. Let's agree what that 7 is, because I can't do all 20. That's just not possible. So you need to give me the inputs and the rationale behind which 7 out of this 20 I choose. And I think that's hugely important. But you can then go on to say, and what should be the next 7, and what should be the next 7, so that you've got this dynamic list, and say if something fundamentally changes, we'll go back and refresh it.
Yeah, but it's kind of breaking those silos and kind of, you're not there by yourself to find the solutions. And last question, I think quite interesting. How can procurement teams drive sustainability initiatives in industries that are traditionally resistant to change?
I think it's about, again, and as I said, part of my background is as a behavioral scientist, which is tapping into and understanding where is the resistance coming from, understanding what the motivations are for the individuals to not want to change. And invariably, change often signals a threat. So if they think there's a threat, I think you've got to face into that and say, what you recognise as being a threat. Is it a real threat? Is it something that often people will say, oh, well, back to what we were talking about earlier about digitalisation, does that mean then that I lose my job? All of that sort of thought process that people go through, because as human beings we're predicated to resist change. That's our normal default mode, which is actually we're quite creatures of habit, actually. So dealing with that, I think, is actually quite important, and having those what I call quality conversations about understanding what people's motivations are, what they see as being the threat, and creating what I call the psychological safety to have those conversations and have what I call conversations that lay out some of the risks and the understanding, the opportunities. I think is all part and parcel of this, because I think it's all part of the understanding the materiality, I'll call it, and the substance of the change at hand before you then start saying we're going to do X, Y, or Z. I think it's about saying this is, so for instance, how could I put it, we can't manually process everything. We've got to digitalize some things. I think then that's part and parcel of the signal that says, let's work through what that should be and prioritize the steps that we can take, the things that are off limits, all those kind of things. So important.
So kind of to summarize, I think it was quite a repeating topic throughout, that we have to more and more often look at the problem from the other side perspective.
From the other side,
and other than just kind of thinking that our perspective is the only perspective on a topic. So no, thank you very much, David. I have really enjoyed the conversation and learned quite a lot myself. And then please download the report from the link below in the comments if you haven't done already. Thank you.